Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. It's that time of year again where I show you my top books of the year, and this year I have 5 top books of 2021 to show you. Overall, this year has been a bit of a weird reading year, mainly because I've been reading a lot of non-fiction, and that's not necessarily weird, but I've just kind of, I guess, switched priorities, which is kind of what I was interested in reading, and so I read a lot more non-fiction than I did fiction this year, which is quite interesting. But actually the majority of these are still fiction, with 2 kind of non-fiction, all about history. And I thought I would start off with my top book, mainly because I'm actually not going to rank the other books, but there is one book especially that kind of stood out to me as being something that really changed me this year and kind of being the most influential book. So I just noticed yet again Sybil was trying to be the main character in my video, but this is a book that, although I'm sure there are other ones that I would consider different types of favourites, I think just because the influence this book had on me and my interests, it has to be the top choice. My top book of 2021 is River Kings by Jarman. I've already talked about this book, and in fact all of the other books, in different videos, so always link those below. But for context with River Kings, when Ben and I went to York, we went to the Jorvik experience, and obviously it takes you around kind of Viking York, and it just really lit a spark inside me, and I had no interest in the Vikings, no knowledge of the Vikings at all before going to that museum. I just kind of skipped over it in my mind, and then I wanted to read as much as I could about the Vikings, and I started with this book, and it really was just the best kind of introduction to me of the Vikings, mainly because it kind of dismayed some of my prejudice I have against the Vikings and kind of the narrative, kind of the mythology we've created around the Vikings. It really looks at the travel and trade of Vikings, which of course they did a lot of, and just say the Vikings from Scandinavia to the Silk Roads. And one thing I really loved about this book is that it kind of really follows one bead, from kind of being found in a burial site all the way kind of across the other side of the world, really, and looking at how I think when we view English history in particular, we view it as kind of a history of isolation, and actual fact there's kind of so many different multicultural elements in our history because of kind of trade and travel. There were just lots of little gems in this book, I guess metaphorically and literally, and I took so much away from it, and you know, there are things now that I know about kind of the Vikings, and especially in archaeology, whether from their kind of burial rites, their burial practices, to looking at their commerce. It really just opened my eye to a whole world of history that I just completely ignored. And since then I've kind of read a lot about the Vikings, and not just the Vikings, and that's all to do kind of with thanks to, I guess, the Jorvik experience, but also River Kings by Jarman. It's a really enjoyable and accessible read, but I also think if you kind of knew a lot about the Vikings, you would still love this book because it is jam-packed with so much kind of academic detail as well. The rest of my selections for my top books of 2021 are in no particular order, but I thought I would stick with kind of non-fiction for now, and I've only got actually one other non-fiction choice, and it is Young, Damned and Fair by Gareth. This is a biography of Henry VIII's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, and what's so great to see about this book, because it's not like massively chunky, but it's so nice to see a book about Catherine Howard that isn't just a couple of pages long, because so often I feel like historians underestimate Catherine Howard as a person, and she's always kind of been one of my favourite wives, even though I know we shouldn't kind of pit women against each other now or in history. It's just so great to see one book just about her, and that's actually something I would love to see more of, because we have a lot of books about all of the wives together, and I feel like Anne Boleyn might be one of the only wives to have a lot of study just about her, and I love Anne Boleyn, but I would love to see more of the individual wives, and so I really enjoyed this. I especially enjoyed this because Catherine Howard, a bit like the Vikings, there's a lot of mythology around Catherine Howard and a lot of prejudice, and they're kind of, you know, falling into the old Madonna whore complex, and it was really nice to see kind of a detailed analysis of her early life in particular, and actually looking at how we approach Catherine and also the relationship she had, consensual and non-consensual, and actually really kind of analysing different kind of power patterns and power imbalances in her life. With all history books, and this goes with River Kings too, what you want is a book that makes you think and challenges you and challenges your own perceptions of history, because every historian, you know, has their own biases in their own way, and they're often always a starting off point and, you know, the beginnings of my own research and my own kind of reading. And this book definitely disrupted my knowledge of Catherine Howard, just in the same way that River Kings did that about my preconceptions of the Vikings. Next we have Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, which I realise I'm like perfectly paired with. But this is a reread for me, and Thomas Hardy is one of my favourite writers. I actually didn't read that many classics this year, and the ones I did, I didn't really enjoy that much apart from Far From the Madding Crowd. But I love Thomas Hardy. I tend to like Thomas Hardy's more depressing novels more, but this is definitely my favourite happy Thomas Hardy novel. I decided to reread Far From the Madding Crowd this year because I joined Boldwood Books, which is obviously named after Farmer Boldwood. There's a connection between our founder's family home, that is where Farmer Boldwood lives. It's Boldwood's farm, and we went there on kind of a big tea meeting day, and I reread it when I was in Dorset, which of course is the perfect place to read Thomas Hardy, and I read it in the grounds of Farmer Boldwood's farm and just had a little bit of a fangirl moment, but it was wonderful. Far From the Madding Crowd is like one of my favourite, I guess, comfort reads, even though it is still full of darkness, like all of kind of Thomas Hardy's works. But I like kind of the stubbornness of it. I like, or of Bathsheba. I like looking at female agency and women in business, which is always something I found really fascinating. I love the complexities of all the characters and also the growth of the characters throughout the novel too. I feel like Thomas Hardy does characterisation like no other writer. It's really interesting when you reread your like favourite novels because it can go really well or really badly. But this just kind of really re-established the book as one of my top favourite classics of all time, and definitely as Bathsheba as being one of my favourite heroines as well, and one I feel quite connected to. But I 100% recommend it, of course. It's one of my favourite books, especially if you don't tend to read a lot of classics and if you haven't read any Hardy before. It's always the book I recommend before Tess, which is my other great favourite novel. But yeah, a beautiful novel as always. It's Thomas Hardy, what more can I say? The next book is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. One of my most anticipated reads anyway. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Noel is one of my favourite books of all time. I do still prefer Jonathan Strange and Mr. Noel, but again, I shouldn't really, they're so different, shouldn't really pit them against each other. Even though there are a lot of shared themes in both novels, which makes sense because it's the same writer. But I think Piranesi, out of all of these books, is the one that I have the most to talk about, and I have talked about it in another video, but it very much feels like a book I could write an essay on. There's a really particular and interesting, I think, reading relationship you have with this book as you go through it, and you go on the same journey as Piranesi. So when you begin the novel, you are just as in awe of the house and its wonders and its tides as Piranesi is. And then as it goes on, it gets darker and everything's unsettled. And there's a particular kind of dramatic irony because you are finding things out. You're on this journey with Piranesi of this slightly kind of undoing of this world. But you actually, you kind of you're putting the puzzle pieces together at the same time as Piranesi, but you're understanding it before he does. And that in itself is just a really interesting play kind of the novel. I know it will sound a bit fluffy when I say that this book is about the meaning of life, but it's about how we get meaning from the world and how we get meaning from life, and whether we look for that meaning in art and in interpretation and in kind of, you know, the more natural part of our being, or whether we look to meaning through analysis and science. And that's showing at the beginning of the book, those different ways of trying to understand the kind of the thing that you can't understand, and looking at identity and how we form identity based on that. And that in itself is a theme that Piranesi shares with Jonathan Strange and Mr. Noel, because there's a lot of discussion in that novel of kind of magic as something that's learned and studied versus something, and obviously that's Mr. Noel, versus you have kind of Jonathan Strange and natural ability, and kind of, you know, that study versus nature almost. There are just so many interesting themes in this book. The meaning of language, how we communicate, is obviously a big one. And also isolation, and actually different experiences of isolation. Also a slight warning against meeting your academic heroes. Piranesi is one of my favourite books because it really made me think, and I was kind of actively engaged in this novel, which is just as important as enjoying a novel. And of course I did enjoy this, but so much of my enjoyment was me working out what the hell was going on. And what I really like about it is that Susanna Clarke plays me so well. Like at the beginning, I'm just as in awe of this world as Piranesi is. I'm thinking about, you know, all the statues and how magical, it has tides. And then as time goes on, you're like, what the fuck? And you start to feel isolated and stuck. And you're trying to figure everything out, and it is so unsettling. And that experience is what Piranesi is going on. So Susanna Clarke really plays you as a reader and takes you on that journey. But there were just so many things that I could analyse about it and take meaning from it, that it was just such an enjoyable puzzle piece to put together from an analytical kind of standpoint, which, you know, I still haven't left university in my heart. So I definitely recommend Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And finally we have Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. This is one of my most anticipated reads of 2021, and in fact it came out in September. So in fact this is the only 2021 release I actually read this year, which just shows that I have just been reading purely for pleasure and just like forgetting all publishing schedules ever. I just really love Sally Rooney as a writer. It's quite rare that I read multiple books by an author that I really enjoy, but I've loved all of hers, and this was something really special. I think I have talked about this in a video as well, probably a little bit more in depth than I will do now. But it is kind of trying to understand your own identity and take meaning from your life and from the world where everything is going to shit, and how we navigate our lives and also the different paths in life that we take. I also highlighted and like dogged so many different pages of this book, which for me is always a really, really good sign that I've kind of enjoyed something. This is also a novel of kind of reflection of the meaning of your life, your relationships with other people, how you formed kind of your identity, and how, you know, the paths you've chosen in life, as well as kind of how do you give your life meaning while the whole world is falling apart, and kind of comparing that to previous civilizations and just trying to understand where we are now and where we're going based on what has previously happened, and also then just trying to navigate a path which actually is your own. Sally Rooney is just a brilliant writer who at once can have these massive big conversations, as well as doing tiny intimate portraits, and they never seem at odds with one another. They always seem so perfectly formed and fitted. Also just a really enjoyable read. I was completely kind of sucked in and addicted and obsessed with reading this book, so just enjoyable, which again should be the point of reading, and I definitely get a lot kind of joy from reading Sally Rooney's works. So this is my last book of 2021. So here they all are, all my top books of 2021. A kind of eclectic mix. It's been an interesting reading year with lots of non-fiction, and it's been a happy reading year, and I'm really excited for 2022. Please let me know if you've read any of these, if we kind of share similar feelings and thoughts, or whether you just hated some of these. It's always interesting to know. Please let me know what your top book of 2021 was. I'm always interested and looking for recommendations. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon in another video.